welcome to Global Affairs Network. And please let me thank you for joining us tonight. The world will never be the same, as you already know. One of the most powerful country on earth, Russia, have invaded Ukraine, and some expert, a political scientist from a Northwest University, and an expert in the former Soviet Union said that is a new world order. Uh, you know, so much to say about that. I'm going to bring my friend, Mr. Paul Pomfrey, one of the analysts on this show. Mr. Paul, welcome to the show. Welcome to Global Affairs Network. I hope you share that thought. Do you think this is the new world order?
No, I think that in fact, what has happened is that there's clearly been a challenge to the old world order at this point, but it's still a process. We have to look at the fact that we here in the United States, who depend on the US media to keep us informed about what's happening in the world, have been kept I would say, the most ill-informed group of people, probably on the face of this earth, that has the ability to have access to electronics, because there's been a very organized effort to mislead the people of this country so that certain business interests in this country can expand their ability to exploit and extort.
But let me I do believe you and me will go back and forth, man. You have your analysis of what's going on, and I respect it. Um, you know, uh, Russia is a superpower, no deny. There's no more conversation, no more debate on that. Russia is a superpower because if you see NATO, who usually has been used throughout the years to destroy country all around the world. If NATO is not daring to go to Russia and to stop Russia, it's clear to us that we're dealing with a superpower. Now,
Oh, there's no question that Russia is a superpower from the perspective that it has the nuclear capability of destroying the world the same way the United States does, the same way Great Britain does, the same way France does. Yes, they
do you
have
think,
it from that perspective.
Ukraine, the president
But
of
I think
Ukraine, has
if
been
you
lied
look
to?
at, for example, I'm
Do you
sorry?
think the president of Russia? Do you think the president of Ukraine was lied to? Do you think
Oh,
he thought America and NATO were actually gonna fight for him, but now he's facing reality. Do you think that
yes, I
was
mean, he's been used. There's no question about that. That NATO, the NATO countries led by the US, have been using Ukraine as a means of trying to compromise the security of the state of Russia. That is no question about that. Ukraine happens to be, in size, the largest country in Europe, other than if you wanted to consider the portion of Russia that happens to be in Europe as well. But when it comes to a country size, by far, Ukraine is bigger than any Western European country. Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, you name it. You could put them inside of Ukraine as far as the size of Ukraine is concerned. The United States has been playing the people of Ukraine for fools. They have edged them on an effort of allowing the NATO to expand to the actual border of Russia, which they've already done in smaller states north of Ukraine. but Ukraine takes up the largest portion of borders to Russia of any country. And the problem that we have today is that the government of Russia made it very clear that they drew the line that NATO nor the European Union could have access that close to their border, very similar to the time that President Kennedy, back in 1962, said at that time to the Soviet Union, "There's no way we're going to allow you to bring nuclear weapons into Cuba." And Cuba wasn't even an actual bordering state to the United States. And it certainly was much smaller compared to the United States than the Ukraine is compared to Russia.
Do you think the world had the capacity to stop Russia at this moment?
Well, the question is, what is it that they're trying to stop Russia from doing? I think it's actually, I would flip that question from the perspective, does Russia have the power to stop the United States and NATO from getting on its border to intimidate Russia and to actually make Russia feel very insecure, and not only make it insecure, but make this a much, much more dangerous world. It's one thing when you have nuclear weapons thousands of miles away from your border. You have time to verify whether or not, in fact, the weapons have been launched. But when you have nuclear weapons right on your border, you have no longer that time to verify. And when you don't have that time, you have made the world much, much more dangerous. Because if a person doesn't have the time to verify a communication mistake, then in fact, it's more apt that then the country will shoot their nuclear weapons. And if that being the case, we can come to pretty much a nuclear war in this country if the United States and NATO keep pushing the envelope against Russia as they tried a few years back in Georgia. And now they're trying to do it with Ukraine.
So do you think at this moment, do you think the reason why we didn't see, because you know what, American NATO, I think, they have openly promised that, Ukraine was welcome to NATO. That was openly promised to Ukraine. Yes. Now, secondly, if you said out of frustration, if America don't stop pushing Russia, we might get into a nuclear war, World War III, possibly. So
I would even put it a step further and say we may be very easily on this doorstep of nuclear annihilation. If the United States and NATO keep pushing their cards and thinking that they're going to intimidate Russia. But I say one thing that I think it's very clear that people need to understand. The United States has over 800 military bases outside of its border. 800 military bases. It has a military budget per year of well over $700 billion. I encourage the listeners of this program to Google how much does Russia spend on its whole military budget. It's about $62 billion that they spend. So we got $62 billion on the Russia side. And then you have just in the United States alone, over $700 billion. Then you add the amount of billions of dollars that Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the other members of NATO nations are spending on the military. And it's quite clear that it's very lopsided and that the real bully in this whole situation is the U.S. government and NATO. They're the ones that want to jeopardize the security of Russia, and Russia's saying they're not going to have it. And for that reason, Ukraine being used as a pawn has caused for a tremendous amount of destruction inside of Ukraine, as well as a loss of life.
So what was American ally was thinking? I mean, because I said, what did the NATO and I mean the U.S. and its allied NATO was thinking? Because this is clearly a proxy war.
Well,
This is a proxy war. It looks like Ukraine is fighting
again, you have to ask the
somebody else's
question:
war.
why does the United States have over 60 military bases in Africa today? Why does the United States have a whole naval fleet right off of the international waters of China today? The bottom line is that the United States wants to keep in a position that it feels it has to exploit the rest of the world at its own will. And the obstacles that they see, the business interests of the United States and the U.S. government, who works for the U.S. business interests, not for the people of the United States, but for the greedy business interests of the United States, is that they want to be able to control all natural resources around the world. And so, because they see a country such as Russia and China, who's not playing along with their game of allowing them to bully countries around the world, they're now trying to figure out ways of how to undermine those governments and weaken those governments to an extent where they do not have those governments posing a challenge to U.S. business interests in robbing the rest of the world.
But this is no longer China and Russia. It looks like India that Russia have proposed to sell India cheap oil, and it looks like India is saying yes. So that is a new dynamics. Before we didn't see that
Well,
before.
again, we must look at the history of India. I mean, it was Great Britain who came into India and exploited the wealth of India for many, many years. And they have kept India in a very dependent state for many, many years. Now, India recognizes that Great Britain is not really ready to give up the kind of economic grip it has on India today, or the United States ready to give up the economic grip it has on India today. And so India looks and says, look, if we're going to move our country forward, we have to look at who we can really do business with and have a more equitable trading situation. And when Russia offered to India that it could give it a better deal for its oil, India said, wait a minute, if we get cheaper oil, we can make products cheaper and be more competitive on the international market than if we have to sit there and pay the high prices for our oil coming from Great Britain, coming from the United States, and the other NATO nations.
But
So
talking about NATO nations, we know that you know probably above 60% of energy that actually feeding into NATO countries. Now because the embargo, do you think at one point the NATO countries will have no choice but to buy some energy from Russia? Otherwise, that part of the world will cool down. They'll be dying, if they don't change their decision or maybe find a way to stop this war as soon as possible.
what has happened is this: the United States has used its economic and military might over its NATO partners and basically trying to force them to do things not in their own best interest. Obviously, Germany and other Western European countries would benefit from the cheaper costing oil and natural gas that they desperately need to keep their standard of living as what it is today, coming from Russia. But they're being bullied by the United States into accepting an embargo against Russia, sanctions against Russia, which will force them to have to buy liquefied natural gas and oil from the United States. Now, let's think about what that really means then. If they end up doing that, it's going to cost them more money to produce their manufactured goods. It's going to cost them more money to do their farming because they need the fuel to run their farm equipment. It's going to cost them more money to produce electricity. And so right now, the United States have forced these countries into paying US more money while they themselves will end up losing money in their ability to be competitive to other Western powers, especially that of the United States. Now, the question comes to mind is how long are these states going to allow that to happen? How long are the people?
But at the same time, here's the question: how long do you think Russia can win this war with bullets and tanks?
Well, let's be frank here. If Russia really wanted to come in and crush Ukraine, the war would have been over 2 weeks ago because they have that firepower to do so. The bottom line is the media is trying to make this situation look much different than it really is. And that is this. They're trying to make it look like that Russia is all out in a war against Ukraine. If that was the case, there would literally be tens of thousands of people who have lost their lives. One of the things the US media has not explained to the people of the United States is that Ukraine has put their military weapons on top of civilian apartment buildings. Anti-tank weapons are sitting on top of these large apartment buildings and a number of other types of buildings inside Ukraine. And Russia can see this equipment using their aircraft and their drones. And so they know these equipments are located on these buildings. So when they attack the buildings with this military equipment sitting on top of it, which is clearly a violation of international law for Ukraine to jeopardize his own civilian lives.
But you mentioned the international law, or some people use war crime. We as African people, we get a little bit confused with that, with the terminology. It looked like some of this international law and war crime only are applicable to some situation, but not everyone. And that's number one point. The second one is, I want to know, do you think if the violence continue in the way that we see today, is that going to give more people the ability to say, you know what, enough is enough? They will probably join the coalition of a willing, as George Bush would put it when he was invading Iraq. Do you think that is going to create some kind of sympathy, or in long term, as people continue to listen to voice like yourself, they're all finding out that basically this is a situation of double standards? Because if America really cares about invading countries, they're supposed to do their own homework. What you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, that's the bottom line, is that we end up, as people here in the United States, get tricked into unnecessary wars around the world. We got tricked into the war of Vietnam. We got tricked into the war of Korea. We got tricked into the war of Iraq. We got tricked into the war of Afghanistan. We're being tricked into wars all the time. And yet the United States tells the people of the United States that, oh, we don't have money to address the needs of the people of the United States. I mean, President Biden ran on a number of promises, and he only pretty much have satisfied, the Democratic Congress has only satisfied one major promise that President Biden made as far as economics is concerned. The rest of them, he said, well, we can't afford it. But all of a sudden, Congress got plenty of time and money, billions of dollars to spend on this unnecessary war that's taking place right now inside of Ukraine. And we as people in this country should be asking our politicians, how is it that we got money to spend on a war that the US and NATO created the conditions for in the beginning, rather than address the needs of the people of this country? I mean, we were promised many things. We were promised assistance to people who, in fact, had to stay home to take care of sick relatives. We were promised money for young people to go to college for the first 2 years. We were promised all kinds of different things when the politicians were running for office. And now they tell us, oh, we don't have the money to do it. But yet, overnight, Congress can find, like magic, tens of billions of dollars to pull into this war. And one has to ask the question, where did the money come from that they didn't have 2 weeks ago, a month ago, but now they have it? And how is it that we're spending it on this war rather than address the needs of the people of this country? Why is it that the United States has talked out of both sides of its mouth to Ukraine? Oh, yes, we want you to be in the European Union. Oh, yes, we want you to be in NATO. And on the other hand, tell them, well, my bad. Y'all just going to have to suffer this war because we're not going to get ourselves involved in it. And then, the weapons are not only being sent to Ukraine, but we're sending weapons over to Poland. Now, anybody who've done their homework recently know that there's been a strong Nazi movement in Poland. And it's been a strong Nazi movement inside of Ukraine. In fact, the government of Ukraine has taken a number of Nazi militias and made it a part of their national army, supposedly because they want them to defend their country. Now, my question is, does the people of the United States know that our tax dollars are funding Nazis' access to our weapons to be used? And what happens? I mean, we know what we did, for example, in Libya, when we brought ISIS out of Syria down to Libya to fight Muammar Gaddafi and gave them training and gave them weapons and then sent them back to Syria. What did ISIS do? ISIS took those weapons and that training and went into Iraq and took over 1/3 of Iraq right after the Libyan war. That was with U.S. weapons and U.S. training. So we're now going to do this with the fascists that are in Poland and the fascists that are in the Ukraine, that we're going to supply them the weapons and the training they need, that once the task that we ask them to do, that you think they don't have a further agenda of taking over the country itself? So how is it that the people of the United States are just accepting a media that lied to us about Vietnam, that lied to us about Afghanistan, that lied to us about Iraq, that lied to us about Korea? They have constantly lied as to justify U.S. military intervention in many parts of the world.
So let me ask you this, because there's some politician here, and I'm talking about Lindsey, Senator Lindsey, who openly is saying that he wish to be able, maybe to encourage people to kill Vladimir Putin, or maybe to take him to the ICC, to the International Court. If said that, journalists confronted him with that, and he actually confirmed that he was happy to be put on the record that he want President Vladimir Putin to be assassinated. And this is a U.S. senator saying something like that, assassination of another president from another country. What are your assessment when you hear that kind of
well, my assessment is fairly clear in the respect that if the court functioned properly, the U.S. president should have been put before the court on many occasions. For example, it should have been put in court when the United States invaded Afghanistan. It should have been brought to court when the United States invaded Iraq. The U.S. government should have been put in court when it invaded Libya. It went into a sovereign state and set up the killing of the head of state in that country. I mean, so if we're going to talk about a court let's talk about a court that really deals with real justice and not just follow the script of NATO, of the European Union, and the United States. I mean, NATO is supposed to be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, how does the North Atlantic Treaty have anything to do with Afghanistan? But NATO was there. How does the North Atlantic have anything to do with Iraq? But NATO was there. So when we talk about countries that have carried out crimes, there have been millions of people in Iraq that have lost their lives. There have been millions of people in Afghanistan that have lost their lives. And then the United States claimed it brought about democracy in those countries. Really? If that's the case, then why was the supposedly democratic elected president on a plane out of the country within hours after the United States claimed it was no longer going to be there? I mean, we need to connect dots and pay attention to everything that's being said about what's going on. And just think, it doesn't make sense, the narrative that our media is telling us today. It just does not make sense at all. And it's clear that the United States is trying to play the bully game so many times in the past. So we must challenge that and say, no, this should not happen. And that, in fact, what we should be doing is saying that our government needs to take care of business here at home, because there's plenty of business here at home. You got people who are unnecessarily dying by policemen not doing their jobs properly. You got people here unnecessarily living on the streets because our social services aren't doing the job because they're not being properly funded. We got people who want to have better schools, but don't have the funding to give better schools because we are wasting our tax dollars on these military ventures, not to benefit the people of this country, but to benefit the super rich, the little one percenters of this country.
So the profiteers always benefit from war, whatever the military industrial complex. They're always the beneficiary of these wars. But I'm more interested in the way the world is now changing in terms of positioning. You started talking about talking about the fact that a country like India taking the position, working for their own interest instead of just listen to the threats coming from the West. They're saying, listen, cheap oil, they need energy. They're buying cheap oil, while here in America, the price of gas is going tremendously high and up.
Yeah.
So I want you to also talk about the position of Africa, knowing that as one of the weakest place. We're seeing African countries, some of them probably pick a side, but most of the countries in Africa are actually playing the neutral game here, because it looks like they are enough. They have enough of these double standards. What you think?
Well, the problem is in Africa today is, I said, the United States has over 60 military bases in Africa. France probably have another 20 or 30 military bases in Africa. And so these governments that are there know that they're there with Big Brother looking over their shoulders. And I'm sure many of those governments may have wanted to say no, that they weren't going to accept the resolutions brought before the United Nations. But in fact, recognize if they did that, it probably would mean that there would be a coup of some type to overthrow them, as has happened so many times in the past when people have taken independent stands. They did it in Ghana. They did it in the Congo. They've done it many times. And so knowing that, it is clear that they did take what you would consider a fairly courageous stand by saying, we're not going to buy into, we're not going to drink this Kool-Aid. We're not going to go along with the European Union and the United States. So we'll just simply abstain. And by enough of those countries abstaining, there was not a large enough vote for the UN to take any type of action against Russia. And so it's they have to again, um, we have to recognize that there has been a real serious need for these countries to feel that they had to take that position and not go along with the US because obviously they know that the US line, the European Union line, the NATO line is not a just one, and it will be the same type of thing that could be used against them sometime in the near future. When you have the United States and Europe that have extorted, exploited, and slaughtered the people of Africa just to steal the natural resources out of Africa over and over again, and have no reaction on the so-called international stage by the European nations, you know, by Australia, by Canada, because of course Australia and Canada with their mining companies are all over Africa, expropriating natural resources out of Africa. And you know that they have a conflict of interest because they're making a lot of money off of robbing Africa. Best example is what they're doing right now in the Congo. Many of the mines inside of the Congo are run either by Australia or by Canada. And then the processing
talking about the Congo though, talking about the Congo, and with respect to your lifetime work on the Congo, you were a fearless defenders of the Congo with everything that we know happening for for decades. We've been seeing million upon million of people die in the Congo. Why do you think the Congolese case, this case of Congo, is not having the appropriate press that it's supposed to? Because we are beyond the European Holocaust in Germany, and this is being a crisis that here in the West we don't see enough press, enough people talking, media talking about it. What do you think is the
Well,
reason?
the media's not going to talk about it because the media's going to do what they're being paid to do, and that is to give out misinformation in behalf of the corporate interests in robbing people in this country and around the world. I mean, when you look at the newscasts, and you have to wonder whether or not they're doing an advertisement or they're doing news when they do fashion shows and other types of things. You watch these morning news shows and you listen to them talk about different specific products made by certain companies, and they're pushing them as if they're telling you news. They're not telling you news, they're advertising. They're in business to make money, and that's their biggest driving force for how they make decisions as a newscast. And so if they're that busy looking for money, you can assume that when they give news about what's happening around the world, they're still being driven by the same thing. They're driven by the money that comes flowing in when they lay out different scenarios that serves the interests of the companies that finance them, that make them billion-dollar companies. And so we need to be very, very clear. You have hedge funds buying out newspapers and buying out other forms of media. Well, everybody knows a hedge fund is not in business to give you news. They're in business to make money. And so if they can satisfy the interests of Lockheed Martin, they satisfy the interests of Nordstrom and all these other military contractors by giving out misinformation or excluding important information when they give the news about what's happening around the world, just so it serves the interests of these companies getting their lucrative contracts from our tax dollars. We must be clear here. This money doesn't just come out of the sky. This is money we pay in our taxes. And we know that when it comes to the tax rate, the average person pays a much higher tax rate than these large multinational corporations that are much more capable. I mean, some of the young people may not realize, but just 30 years ago, tax rates for corporations were in the 90 percentile. brackets.
No, you mentioned a lot. This a lot of information is going out. I want to put this out here. When you read this, for example, national versus foreign investment, we know that President Biden pledged 800 million to Ukraine, and after Zelensky plea for more aid. I'm talking about 800 million. Uh,
What they don't talk about was how many millions of dollars went to shipping U.S. troops from the United States over to Eastern Europe. How many millions of dollars went into the fuel and the housing and the feeding and all the other things that took place? Because when they take a National Guard and make them an active duty, they now got to pay him full time. So what was that cost? I mean, he's only talking about what he's actually putting inside the border of Ukraine, and that's only what he's giving publicly to Ukraine. We know very well that the United States, when it does war, many stuff that's spent is done under the table. It's a part of, they put it, national security, and so they're not going to publicly talk about it. But let's be clear here. They've been very clear about talking about sending jets over to Poland, sending jets over to other countries in Eastern Europe, and members of NATO, but at one time members of the Warsaw Pact. So when we look at this number of 800 million, I kind of chuckle at it because I know good and well that that's a very lowball number, that the United States is spending way more money than $800 million on this war. At the same time, it's telling the people of this country, oh, well, we don't have money.
but this is probably the beginning, because once the war is over, there will be a substantial amount of money to rebuild Ukraine, because we see the same happen after Second World War, when Europe was destroyed. There was a lot of money.
Again, you say the word bill, I say the word bribe.
Okay.
The money that U.S. spends on Ukraine is more from the format of a bribe than just to build a country. And again, we must understand that this money is also going to the people who clearly define themselves as fascists inside of Ukraine. And that the weapons that we're sending to Ukraine are going in the hands of fascists inside Ukraine.
You mentioned weapon a lot. I just wanted to see, because at the beginning you were telling us that the United States actually spend more money building our military here at home, to protect us. But at the same time, it looks like when you see the budget, compare the budget between the United States and Russia, this seems to have a decent army over there with sophisticated weapon, but they don't really spend that much. Once you look trying to look the numbers here, and U.S. versus Russia military spending defense, looks like Russia is only 60 billion and the United States is 731 billion. What's up with that?
This is what I'm saying again. This is why the United States doesn't have the money to address the needs of the people of this country. I mean, just think about the roads you travel on every day and how messed up they are, and messing up your tires, messing up your shock absorbers, and throwing your wheels out of alignment because these roads aren't properly maintained. These are jobs, these are types of money being spent that will address the issue of good paying jobs here in this country. Instead, no, this country is wasting money on its military ventures around the world, more so than any other 10 nations combined. If you took the military budget of China, of Russia, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, South Korea, and Japan, you still won't match the amount of money the United States spends on its military. So who's the bully? That's the question we need to ask. Who is really the bully here? Obviously, Russia knows how much weapons money the United States spends. They're not going to go and do some crazy adventurous thing unless they feel they definitely have to do it just for their own survival.
Yeah,
You
but
know, I mean, you find people.
we can say everything all night. It's still the facts still remain the same. Two bad things don't make anything better. I don't think beyond the fact, we're not taking away the fact that it's not okay to invade, a neighborhood, country. It's not okay. But at the same time, we have to understand reason behind that invasion. How come Russia, was pushed to the corner in a position where he think he has to defend himself?
May I ask you a question? You said it's not okay to invade a country, but let's look at what the government of Ukraine has done over the last 8 years, ever since 2014. They have killed literally tens of thousands of people in Ukraine who spoke Russian. And the United States never opened their mouths about that. Why? Clearly, they're not tens of thousands of people who have lost their lives in Ukraine today. And yet, the United States is spending hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to send to Ukraine. What happened to the lives that have been killed over the last 8 years by the Ukrainian government? That because the media doesn't talk about it doesn't mean that they have not carried out war crimes themselves against their own people. And when they continue to escalate it, was when Russia said enough is enough. Because many of the people they were killing had relatives in Russia who are Russian. Now I ask you this question. If in fact, inside of Canada, there were 500,000 people from the United States in Canada, because right now you have Canada, you have the English-speaking part of Canada and the French-speaking part of Canada. What happens if the national government of Canada decided they want to go out on all-out war and killing the French people inside of Canada, French-speaking people inside of Canada? Do you really think France would sit back and not consider the idea of invading Canada? I would think not. I think they probably would. Because their family members in France would say, wait a minute, these are our relatives that are being abused.
Yeah, but the geography of France and Canada is kind of different, though. I mean, I can understand how Russia feel because, these are neighborhoods country. I know in Canada, Quebec, people speak French, but the geography of it can make it a little bit difficult to just invade or just react violently to defend any people. But if you see the geography, because keep in mind, Ukraine was a part of a Soviet Union and Russia.
Right.
So they were, that's why you're saying some people in Ukraine still speak Russian to this day. So technically, they were the same country before. So, the proximity really explained a lot in what we're seeing happening right now. Because if you're pushed to the corner and you know that people that you see as an enemy are keeping, getting ground, and the chance are you will feel the way America felt when in the Bay of Pigs back in the 60s when those missiles were put in Cuba. So we I don't want to play the devil advocate right here, but the point of the matter is we have to see the always two sides of the story. We cannot just put our eyes on one side of the story and listen only one side. And unfortunately, in our media, in our conversation, that we hear more of one side of the story. And for people that are supposed to be intellectual, I think it is our responsibility to try and to see both sides and understand clearly what is good, what is going on in this conflict here. So one thing that
definitely, I'm gonna ask you this: if you had a knife,
Right.
and somebody else that was your opposition had a
Again.
a shotgun, a
Yeah.
shotgun.
Yeah.
Okay, now you would have to think 10 times as to whether or not, in fact, you're going to challenge the person with a shotgun. But if you see the person with the shotgun doing things that you figure if they continue to get away with it, they're going to destroy you. That even though you only have that knife, you're going to use it
Yeah.
and defend yourself.
So you think the
And
case of is a case of self defense?
I think that, yes, I think that Russia made it very clear, the same way the United States made it very clear, that they were not going to allow a adversary government, whether it be in the shape of NATO or the United States, to come on a border as much as the size of Georgia or the size of Ukraine onto
But
their
but
neighboring
but,
border.
but at the same time, if we trying to look historically speaking, it was George Bush the father that actually promised to Mikhail Gorbachev that if they are, they give up. I can't remember the thing. In return, they promised
East
Russia.
Germany, if they allowed East Germany
Yeah,
to unite with West Germany.
absolutely. If and then in return, they will give up the idea of trying to get ground to or trying to bring those countries around Russia to NATO. That was a promise. I mean, later on,
Promise
the
was
United
that they
States,
would not expand NATO any further east.
absolutely. So later on,
Correct.
they say that they never they wouldn't there was none anything like that promised to Russia. But records, when we read records, it
Well, I
looks
mean,
like
it's already been a number of documents that clearly points out that that's exactly what the Bush administration said on several different levels, including on the level of their Secretary of State, that they had agreed to that. And so, and there have been many people who were witnesses to those agreements who stated the same thing. Yes, this is what was said. This was what was agreed upon. But the United States chose to break that commitment. And the person who did it, began it, was a guy by the name of William Jefferson Clinton. People have a tendency to run around talking about how much better the Democratic Party is over the Republican Party. And I just see in both of those parties twilly dee and twilly dum, that they neither one of them are sincere about striving for peace and striving for justice. Instead, they're striving for greed. And this is why, in my opinion, we must challenge them on how they go about doing their business. Because, in fact, what is happening is that they're not serving the interests of the people of this country. They're not serving the interests of even peace and justice around this world. They're only serving the interests of the greedy of this country, the large multinational corporations. And
do
that
you,
the history of this country, from its very beginning, by them endorsing the idea of slavery and genocide against Native Americans, slavery against people of African descent, and genocide against the Native Americans, that this government has been very consistent in not expressing or following any real principles of democracy and justice, but of that of greed. And we, the people of this country, have a responsibility to demand this country to do better.
unless we the people really understand the what's going on, it is even harder to demand, because
Well,
if
the
the
point
media
is, we end
is
up being the victims. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. No, I
you didn't
totally
find, you don't
completely
find, yes, you don't
completely
find
agree
rich
with you.
people, children
Yeah.
fighting in our wars.
Uh-huh.
You may
So
find some politician children fighting in our wars, but you don't find the super rich people fighting in our wars. They've
here
always been exempt.
many Trump supporter was thinking that Trump was a if Trump was the president, this would never happen. Do you disagree or agree with that?
Well, Trump was a person that was hard to predict what he was going to do because usually his decisions were not had not a lot to do with how the corporations wanted him to do something, but how he himself personally felt about the situation. I mean, you saw that with his relationship with North Korea. You saw that with his relationship with with NATO. You know that in fact the large corporations wanted him to do one thing, and he then pushed another agenda. So it's hard to predict how Trump would do something. But I would say that whatever he did, it wasn't because he was serving the interests of the people of this country. He did it for personal reasons. And he was seeking to serve his own personal agenda, often in ways of how he could get money in his own personal pocket.
But the fact of the matter is, there was some kind of the French people would say deterrent. There was a time of peace when this man was in power. You went to North Korea when America was thinking it's impossible to even to talk to Kim Jong Jong, whatever his name is, and also it looks like he have a good chemistry with Putin. Now, I'm not really the Republican, but we've seen him acting. But at the same time, some expert would say that, oh, you know what? The reason why Russia was not doing anything because Trump was doing whatever Putin wanted him to do in the first place. And why is that? It was that Trump was very
Well, again,
adamant trying to destroy. Let
I
me finish the
believe,
point. Let me finish the point. Trump was adamant when it comes to trying to distance himself from NATO. That was something Putin will want, and I know you agree with me. At the same time, even the money, the finance that was going to NATO, Trump was not, into it. Turns out that is something that Putin actually wanted it. So when you look both sides, of the coin right here, it looks like you have maybe give some kind of credit, even if he didn't do that with the understanding that he was serving the enemy, or he did that just to maintain peace in the world. You think that's a good assessment?
well, I think no. I think that basically Trump again had his own agenda. Now, sometimes his agenda matched up with the right thing to do. Sometimes his agenda did not. His agenda was all over the place. It was sometimes often to predict what Trump would or would not do. But at the same time, the reality is the reason why both the Democrats and many of the Republicans did not like Trump was because their job was to serve the interests of the large multinational corporations, not to serve a personal interest of a businessman such as Trump. And so this is why I saw them many times at odds with each other between Trump and the established political parties, whether you be Democrat or Republican. But I think, again, we must ask ourselves, do we want to be a country focused on doing what's right, striving for peace, striving for justice? Or do we want to be the lapdogs of these very greedy corporations that are eating up other corporations every day for lunch? And as they do that, it makes our country less democratic, less peaceful, and less seeking for justice.
So let me
And
ask
that's the
you,
question we need to ask.
the moral compass. We both understand that America is an empire, and we know what the empire do to maintain its global position. Uh, but you have to balance sometimes with moral compass, because the way people respect you within the country or even abroad, if you are promoting something that they see as a higher value. Let's see, for example, democracy. At one point, the entire global were actually supporting America, was behind America with that idea of democracy. But we see America falling short to deliver that promise to the world. Number one, we went to a war in Iraq based on absolute lie, and we're seeing the President Trump, President Bush himself, even making fun on the fact that he didn't find weapon of mass destruction, knowing that million upon million of young kids, women, innocent people perished in that war, including American people. Our, military, that we lost treasure, we lost human being in that war. But there was no apology, even to the American people, for what they did. So in long term, what would be the risk? Because in long term, it looks like if we don't get our act correct, we will lose that respectability that we're supposed to be having across the globe. We're seeing right now, I get the example of India saying, listen, that now is my business. I'm going to focus on my personal interest. They're going with Russia. They're not listening to America. They're going with Russia, buying cheap oil from Russia. When we suffer here with, the highest expensive when it comes to gas at the pump. At the same time, America also trying to bully China not to deal with Russia. I think that is not working quite good, like we expected. So in the long run, if country upon country are starting to look other way, do you think the global leadership, the moral leadership that America used to have, it will diminish, and it's just a matter of time. Nobody will actually listen to our leadership or even trust our leadership around the globe.
Well, I would say it's not an automatic situation as to whether or not that happens. But I do say clearly that more and more people have come to the reality that it's not in their best interest to go along with the lies and the unjust moves that are being promoted and pushed by the US government and as well by NATO and the European Union. And so for that, you're finding more and more countries, because for all you know, some 30, 40 years ago, they had the non-aligned movement that had been developed in the world, led by India and Cuba. And I think that, in fact, that type of feeling is now going back again. That yes, falling in line and falling behind the United States and NATO has not benefited countries like India, has not really even benefited Pakistan. And so these countries are beginning to question what is in their best interest. And they find going along wholeheartedly in step with the United States, NATO, and the European Union doesn't serve their best interest or their country's best interest. And so they are stepping back and saying, no, we're not going to vote for your resolution.
Absolutely. And
So,
so when you see the situation, what can Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, what can he do? Because I personally, think this guy is not as smart as people think he is. Because if you put your people, a president's first job is to protect his own people. But if you go ahead and listen to somebody who's telling you, I'm gonna come to protect you, or I will come to fight for you, and you go and you put the risk, or you put your people at risk, and to the point that now you're begging, because you've been begging. I see him all on almost all the TV in Europe. I see the Canadian applauding him, the British applauding him. He appeared to the highest appeal to the highest power of this world, and everybody's applauding him. Now my question is, applauding is different from coming to fight for you. They might send you money. in terms of war, there's a lot of transaction that need to be done. If I send you money when you in the middle of fighting, I don't know how you're gonna be taking the time to use that money. All of that kind of nonsense. My thing is, what can he do at this particular moment to say, you know what, I'm gonna put my pride aside and I'm gonna talk to Putin and cut a deal with him as soon as possible, because the longer this war will last, I think more damages will be upon the Ukraine. And even after when we talk about nation building, but guess what? We talk about nation building in Iraq. The country will be back into the Stone Age. So can he just call Putin and say, you know what, that idea was a stupid idea, trying to join NATO. I think we can, stop this nonsense war. And I understand your position that, you are reacting to somebody who is defending himself. It's national interest. So I want to hear what you have to say. What can Zelensky do at this moment instead of just continue to demand and ask for military aid and some money for for the NATO United States to do more? Can he just step up and say, okay, I have enough. I have enough. Let's just cut a deal. Let's just bring about peace.
Well, again, I think what's going to end up happening is this. The people in Ukraine know what's been going on in Ukraine for the last 8 years. They know what's been going on. And I think this is one of the reasons why the media from this country is picking and choosing who they ask questions to and to try to get answers. Because, in fact, they know the people themselves know what's going on. Now, people aren't crazy. Why are people staying in Ukraine and not leaving? Because they basically feel this war has nothing to do with them. And that, in fact, short of the United States, short of the military of Ukraine trying to put anti-tank weapons on top of apartment buildings, feeling that the tanks may not attack the apartment buildings and get close enough that they can then blow up the tanks. But they still understand that Russia does have drones and Russia does have aircraft, and they can fly over top of these buildings and see these anti-tank weapons perched on the roofs of these buildings. So the bottom line is, the United States is spreading a lot of money around. Our money that should be addressing the problems here in this country. They're spreading it around in Eastern Europe amongst the Ukrainian people. At the same time, you may be aware that African students and people of color that were studying there in Ukraine because education is fairly cheap were being pushed off of trains, pushed off of buses, told they couldn't get on planes to try to escape the danger of war. So we're dealing with a government here and with a group of people who have practiced some fairly racist, backwards action. And one has to ask the question, how far does this go? Is this just one isolated incident? Or if in fact there's so many Ukrainians who think this way?
But does America have the moral compass to even address the question of racism?
Well, I think yes. I think the people in the United States should say no to the expending of money on this war, because all we're doing is adding gas.
No, I'm talking about the specific question of racism, because we're still struggling. Well, we can even solve the issues here in America.
The racism itself, you notice that the U.S. government has pretty much not said much about it, and U.S. media has not said much about it. But you get the media from other sources, because now you have the ability of the internet, and you have the ability of WhatsApp and Twitter and Zoom and a whole bunch of other means of communicating with the public. We don't get most of that information from the media.
There's a listener. I'm sorry, Mr. Palmer. you were saying, some important stuff. We have some a listener here, viewer here, who is talking about welfare artillery is a form of asking one to submit. Do you think this probably that's a lady Miss Naziwa Teddy is that making that assessment. Do you think Putin that is Putin way to kind of bring Ukraine to submit to give up on the idea of joining NATO, and the second question probably will be, why do you think that's the last result? Because you think if you know Zelensky joined NATO, that could possibly bring Russia to a very, very precarious position, a very dangerous place if he do that. So that's an existential situation here. So yeah, I'll let you answer for this is a another way to bring Ukraine to his knees and to give up to that idea.
Well, again, the fact is that right around the time that the Berlin Wall went down, Putin asked the United asked to join NATO as well as the European Union. But the big business class in those countries said no because Russia was a fairly developed country and could be a good competitor for some of those businesses. And so their answer to that was no. And so you're not talking about the United States fighting a socialist country at all. It's one capitalist country in conflict with another capitalist country. And this is something that the media tends to kind of stay away from talking about because they want us to still see Russia as the Soviet Union and Putin as a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But if you study the economy of Russia, you'll find that, in fact, it is a very capitalistic country. But it's
But
also,
capitalistic, but it looks like it's been managed by oligarchs. And I wanted to even ask you a question on that. Usually, when America go and trying to deliver a country like they did in Iraq, they usually say, "We're not fighting the people of Iraq. This is a war against Saddam Hussein, for example." But in the case of Russia, it looks like the people that is not directly, I mean, the people Russia was suffering, I mean, the business class is totally associated with Putin in this war. They've been taking a serious hit from Europe to America. There's a lot of stuff, and unfortunately here in America, the business class as well is joining force against Russia. So this is some kind of a it's a little bit different from the usual. Historically, business class always stay away from politics and what's going on in the world. But this time, we've seen the South African born Elon Musk, businessman, American business, South African born Elon Musk, completely out of his way, attacking directly, Putin. It is a different world we're living in, and also the fact that a lot of pressure have been putting on the oligarch around Putin. Do you think things have changed? Is this for the better or for the worst?
well, again, you have to remember that Russia is a capitalist country. It's not a socialist country. And so you got one group of capitalists fighting against another group of capitalists. The difference is that NATO with the United States is clearly a more dominant, militarily equipped um, group of nations than that of Russia. And as long as it stays a hot war, not using nuclear weapons, clearly Russia has a certain advantage over Ukraine. But again, if NATO got involved, obviously they have more ammunition, more equipment to fight a war than Russia does. And NATO countries are basically set up for an offensive battle, where right now the budget compared to the Soviet Union in Russia is a military of a defensive value. And so, because of that, the United States thought they could take advantage of Russia and push this agenda and take a chance of pushing this agenda. But again, it's not serving the interests of the people of this country. Our needs are still not being met and are being justified in not being met because of a war crime that the United States itself has been carrying out with the government of Ukraine. So we need to challenge it. I think that people who believe in peace and believe in justice must demand that U.S. troops be brought back home, that the Congress rescind these billions of our tax dollars that they're adding on to the U.S. military budget to be sent to Europe. In fact, there should be a need to demand that why, of all countries, does the United States need to have all these military bases in Germany in the first place? Germany has a much stronger economy than we do.
Right.
So why are we supplementing that economy with our military bases? This needs to come to an end. Again, we need to cut back as many ways as possible so that our tax dollars is used to address the needs of the people of our country.
So you think
Instead of the needs of
America expansionism will will really hit to the heart of our economy, and possibly ruin the economy as we know it? You think if we're not paying attention on how we spend, I will continue to expand our military might everywhere, with based on almost every corner of this planet, that but that's what their empire do, right? And that can also be the seed that possibly will lead us to our own destruction. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that Rome fell, France fell, the great British Empire fell. Why do we think that the empire of the United States is immune from failure? After all, our money has no physical value. It's considered valuable because of the petrodollar, because 98% of the countries in this world that sells oil are asking for only US dollars back.
But is that a very serious proposition? Because in the end, when you want to cut tie with Russia, you want to cut tie with China. China in long term understood that at one point I've changed the way that I deal with myself and the world, rest of the world globally. Now they have created their own system, a financial system, and now we have Russia, which happen to be also one of the biggest player in the global economy. Do you think in long term, if Russia, for example, say, you know what, okay, so you don't want me, you took all your business out, what I'm gonna do is also cut tie with the way we used to consider dollars. We're gonna be, dealing with the world in terms of, like, for example, gold, or change the way we operate, maybe a cryptocurrency or something like that, and then dollar we no longer have the kind of influence and value it used to have. Is that something that you see can hurt America long term?
Well, a lot of things can hurt the United States. The question comes in, because we can go through 100 different scenarios that could hurt the United States. The real question comes in, are the people of the United States going to do their homework? Because democracy is not free. Democracy is a system that says that the people of that society must do their homework. If not, then in fact, they can't practice their democratic rights because it's like someone saying, you have the right to drive down the road, but you can't hold on to the steering wheel. Or we're going to blindfold you. Either way, you're pretty guaranteed you're going to wreck. And that's what's happening with the people of this country right now. We're not being informed by honest forces too often. And as we're being misinformed of what's going on, they're suggesting for us that we should spend our tax dollars on a government that promotes world danger.
Absolutely.
To our society, to the people living here.
Mr. Paul, it's always a pleasure, man. Your insight and your expertise in the global politics, and it's amazing. And no wonder why people always want you to come back on this program. I appreciate your time and your analysis. And my brother, I think we get to the end of it. I don't know if you have one last word you want to say, but
I just want to say that I encourage the listeners and the people who watch this program to recognize that democracy requires people to do a certain amount of work, and that is do the homework. We now do have access to the internet. We can look up what the United States spends on the military. We can look up what Russia spends on the military. We can even look up what Ukraine spends on the military. We need to have a better understanding of what's really going on. And that when you have that understanding, you can pick up the lies that we're being told by the media and by our politicians. And our job will then to challenge them and
Absolutely.
make statements like, look, we have a responsibility to do what's right. But democracy only works when the people put their work into making it happen.
Yeah.
It's not an automatic.
And uninformed people cannot make it a democracy successful.
Correct. It's not an automatic system. It's not like it's on automatic drive and it automatically works because someone says they got a constitution about talking about democracy. No. Yeah. The only way democracy is going to work is that we do our homework and we make sure we're the drivers of democracy. We have to make sure that we're driving it in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Towards peace and justice in the world.
Absolutely. Listen, my brother.
So I thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts.
This is the last. Isn't the last time we're gonna be seeing you on this program. To our viewers, I want to give a shout out to our friend and the supporter and Naziru Atedi that's always here supporting us through this journey. We appreciate you as well, and we look forward and to give you more insight and a different perspective on what is going on in our world today. My guest today was Mr. Paul Pomfrey, a political social analyst on Gain TV. I'm Malik Lenzanzo. We'll see you next time. Thank you.